An alien veteran reveals the truth about humans in combat. The first human I ever saw in a combat zone was eating something out of a small silver wrapper and looking at a tactical map like it owed him money. His name was Corporal Owen Price. He was 23 years old, medium height, with the kind of face that looked like it had never been surprised by anything in its life. The briefing room was full of senior officers from 4 different species, all of them standing in careful, respectful postures. Owen Price was sitting with his boots on the edge of the table, and nobody said a word to him about it. I remember thinking, this species is going to get itself destroyed in the first week. My name is Grelthus. I served for 41 cycles in the Military Intelligence Division of the HFY Compact. I have fought beside species that communicate through vibration, species that see in spectrums humans cannot even imagine, species whose bodies can survive temperatures that would reduce a human to nothing. I have written 37 field reports about alien combat behavior. I have given this lecture 212 times. I have spent more time thinking about humans than about any other subject in my long career. Let me tell you what I found. When the HFY Compact first made contact with Earth, our scientific team spent 6 months cataloging human biology before anyone in military command took the project seriously. The report was not flattering. Humans have no natural armor. Their skin tears easily. They have no venom, no toxins, no biological defense mechanisms beyond a reasonably effective immune system. Their eyesight is poor in low light. Their hearing is average at best. They sleep for roughly 1/3 of every day, which, from a military standpoint, is an enormous vulnerability. The report concluded that humans were, biologically speaking, somewhere between a Tier 3 and Tier 4 species in terms of combat potential. The panel that reviewed the findings voted unanimously to classify humanity as a non-priority military contact. They would be useful for resource exchange, perhaps cultural diplomacy, but not for warfare. I was not on that panel. I read the report afterward, and I remember thinking that it was thorough, well-organized, and completely wrong about everything that actually mattered. But I did not know that yet. I learned it slowly, the way you learn most important things, by watching something happen that you were absolutely certain could not happen. The battle at Kethmora Station was not supposed to be complicated. The HFY Compact had been engaged for 2 years in a slow, grinding conflict with an expansionist force called the Dravari Collective, and Kethmora was a resupply station positioned at a critical junction in the outer corridor. The collective wanted it. We needed to hold it. The math was straightforward. Human forces had been attached to our combined unit 3 weeks earlier as part of a new coalition agreement. Nobody in our command structure had requested them. The order came from above, the kind of order that arrives with a great deal of diplomatic language and very little military reasoning. The humans were assigned to hold the rear sector of the station, a position our analyst considered low risk. It was, in the technical language of field operations, the safe posting. Our main forces held the forward sectors. The plan was solid. The plan lasted until the 4th hour of engagement, when the collective launched a secondary assault from a vector our intelligence had marked as impassable. It was not impassable. Our forward lines held for 2 more hours and then began to fold. By the 6th hour, the rear sector was the front. I was positioned in the central command node when the communication came in from the human unit. The voice on the line was calm, not the careful, controlled calm of a trained soldier managing fear. Something else, something flatter and more focused than calm. It was the voice of someone who had already processed the situation and moved past the part where it was a problem. We have eyes on the advance. They are coming through the eastern corridor in force. We are holding our position and reorienting to meet them. We will need ammunition resupply at the following coordinates. That was it. No request for evacuation. No report of casualties leading to a withdrawal request. No panic in the transmission. They told us where the threat was, told us they were handling it, and told us what they needed to keep handling it. I looked at the tactical display. The eastern corridor was not a defensible position by any standard model we used. The geometry was wrong. The approach angles were wrong. Our own forces had already begun pulling back from adjacent sectors because the math of holding those positions simply did not work. The humans were not doing the math, or rather, they were doing a different kind of math entirely. I asked the senior human liaison officer standing near me, a tall woman named Lieutenant Carol Webb, what her assessment was. She looked at the display for about 3 seconds. Then she said, "Owen's unit will hold it. They have good people in that corridor." I asked her how she could possibly know that. she said, because Owen hates losing more than he is afraid of anything. I did not understand what that meant at the time. I wrote it down in my field notes because something about it felt important, even if I could not name what. The Eastern Corridor held. Not for an hour. Not for 2. The human unit held that position for 9 hours, in conditions that our tactical models, when I ran the simulation afterward, suggested required a force 3 times their size. They held it with the people they had, the supplies they had, and what I can only describe as a complete unwillingness to accept the conclusion that they should not have been able to hold it. When the reinforcements finally reached them, the corridor was still in our hands. I walked through that corridor the next morning. I was looking for something I could name, some tactical genius, some extraordinary piece of engineering or fortification that explained what had happened. What I found were improvised barricades made from broken equipment, handwritten notes to each other left on the walls as information passed between positions, and evidence of at least 3 separate moments where the unit had adapted its approach on the fly, without any communication from command. They had not followed the plan because the plan had stopped being relevant. They had looked at the situation as it actually was, made new decisions, and kept going. Owen Price was sitting against the wall at the far end of the corridor when I found him. He was eating something again, another silver wrapper. He looked up at me with those calm, unsurprised eyes and said, "Rough night." I told him that what his unit had accomplished was not supposed to be possible. He thought about that for a moment. Then he shrugged and said, "We did not know that." I have thought about that answer every day for 30 years. They did not know it was impossible, and so they did not stop. I want you to understand something about what I am telling you, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am not saying that humans are unbeatable. I am not saying they are the greatest warriors in the galaxy. I am saying that the way they process a situation that should cause surrender is unlike anything I have ever encountered in 4 decades of military service. Every other species I have studied has a threshold, a point at which the calculation becomes clear, the loss is too high, the odds too steep, and the rational response is to stop. This is not weakness. This is intelligence. Knowing when to withdraw is as important as knowing when to advance. Every serious military tradition in the known galaxy teaches this. Humans teach it too. I have read their military manuals. They understand the concept perfectly well in theory. They simply refuse to apply it at the moments when applying it would save their lives. I walked out of Kethmora Station 3 days later, with a very different file in my head than the one I had arrived with. The official report still said humans were a Tier 3 combat species. I no longer believed the official report. What I believed, standing in the pale light of that corridor with the smell of a 9-hour battle still heavy in the air, was that someone in our assessment process had made a very significant error. They had measured everything about humans that could be measured, and missed the one thing that could not be put into a chart. I did not have a word for it yet. I spent the next 2 years looking for one. I am still not sure I have found the right one, but I will do my best to explain it to you before this lecture is finished. For now, understand this. On the day I stopped underestimating humans, I was standing in a corridor that should have fallen, looking at a young man eating something out of a silver wrapper, who did not know he had done the impossible, and therefore had simply done it. That was the beginning of everything I know. 3 days after Kethmora, I was in the field hospital with a plasma burn across my left side that the medical staff kept describing as not life-threatening but also not trivial. I had been moved from the active command node when a secondary explosion took out part of the eastern wall, and something had clipped me on the way down. It was not serious enough to transport back to the main base, so I stayed in the field hospital and watched. There is no better place to understand soldiers than a field hospital. Not the battlefield where everything is noise and motion. The hospital is where you see what people are made of when the immediate threat is over, and the body finally has a moment to report what it has been through. I watched Vorkai soldiers come in. I watched Dravathi soldiers come in. I watched soldiers from the Sulin coalition come in. Each species handles injury in a way that reflects something true about them. Vorkai become very quiet and very still. Dravathi communicate pain in a complex series of tonal expressions that takes hours to fully process. Sulin soldiers tend to sleep almost immediately, a biological response that accelerates their recovery. Then the first human soldier came through the door of the tent arguing with the medic. Her name was Private Lucy Hale. She was 20 years old and had taken a hit to her left arm that had, according to the attending physician, fractured 2 structural bones and temporarily compromised the use of her hand. The medic was explaining that she needed rest and immobilization for the healing process to begin correctly. Lucy Hale was explaining that she had a unit to get back to. This went on for several minutes. I watched from my cot with what I imagine was a fairly obvious expression of confusion. The medic was not wrong. The injury required rest. That was simply medical fact. But Lucy Hale was not arguing with the medical facts. She was arguing with the conclusion the medic was drawing from them. "I can still use my right hand," she said. "My legs work. My eyes work. I am not finished." The medic said she could become permanently damaged if she returned to the field before the injury was stabilized. Lucy Hale said, "Then stabilize it faster." She was back with her unit within 4 hours. I watched her leave the tent. The medic watched her leave, and then turned to me with an expression I recognized across species lines. It was the expression of someone who had just lost an argument they were absolutely certain they should have won. Over the next 3 days, I saw this same exchange happen 7 more times, with 7 different human soldiers, with 7 different injuries. Not all of them were cleared to leave, but all of them tried. Every single one of them had to be actively persuaded, in several cases physically restrained, to accept that rest was a necessary part of recovery. I began keeping notes, not official field notes for my report, just observations for myself, because something was building in my understanding that I did not yet have the framework to express properly. On the second day, a man came in with a wound to his shoulder that had gone untreated for approximately 6 hours because he had not wanted to leave his position. His name was Sergeant Arthur Dale. He was 31 years old, with a quiet face and very steady eyes. While the physician worked on his shoulder, Arthur Dale was updating his unit's tactical notes on a small handheld device, one-handed, asking questions via radio about the current status of the forward position. I asked him why he had waited 6 hours to seek medical attention. He looked up at me. He thought about the question seriously, the way someone does when they want to give you an honest answer, rather than a polite one. "We were busy," he said. I asked if the pain had not been a significant factor. He said, "Of course it was." I asked why that had not changed his decision. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that I have written down and reread more times than I can count. "Pain tells you that something is wrong. It does not tell you what to do about it. That part is up to you." I sat with that for a long time. Every species I had ever studied treats pain as a directive. It is a signal from the body to the brain that contains instructions. Stop, withdraw, protect the damaged area, seek safety. That is what pain is for. It is a survival tool built by millions of years of biological pressure, and it works. Species that respond appropriately to pain survive long enough to pass on their genes. Arthur Dale was telling me that humans hear the signal, understand it completely, and then make a separate decision about whether to follow it. That is not stubbornness. It is something much more structured than that. It is the ability to receive information from your own body and choose a different response based on factors that the body cannot account for. The body does not know about the corridor that needs holding. The body does not know about the 14 people in a unit who depend on the sergeant being at his post. The body only knows that the shoulder is damaged and the shoulder should be protected. Arthur Dale knew all of those things, and he decided the shoulder could wait. I started asking questions more deliberately after that. I spoke to human soldiers in the hospital, during their brief windows of rest, and what I found was that almost all of them had a version of the same answer when I asked them why they kept going under conditions that would stop other species. They did not think about the overall scale of the conflict. They did not think about strategic objectives or political outcomes. They thought about the people next to them, specific people, with specific names and specific faces, who were still out there. Private Lucy Hale told me she went back because Corporal Owen Price's unit was short-handed, and Owen had been awake for 31 hours. Sergeant Arthur Dale told me he stayed at his post because the 2 youngest soldiers in his section had never been in a situation like this before, and he did not want them to be alone in it. A young soldier named Private Ben Marsh, who had come in with a head wound that was serious enough that he should not have been conscious and was conducting a perfectly coherent conversation with me, told me he needed to get back because he had made a promise to his friend that they would both go home. I did not ask what happened to the friend. The way Ben Marsh said it told me everything I needed to know. He made the promise. His friend could no longer keep his half of it. That meant Ben Marsh had to keep both halves. He left the hospital the next morning. It was on the 3rd day in that hospital tent that I began to understand something that changed the entire framework I had been using to analyze human behavior in combat. I had been approaching them as a biological puzzle, a species with below-average physical capabilities that was somehow producing above-average results in the field. I was looking for the mechanical explanation, the training technique, the tactical philosophy, the genetic quirk. There is no mechanical explanation. The answer is not in their bodies at all. The answer is in how they think about each other. Let me explain this carefully, because I want you to understand it correctly. Most species in combat form units for efficiency. A group of soldiers is more effective than a single soldier, so you group them together. The bonds that form between unit members are a welcome side effect of proximity, a way of maintaining morale and communication, but they are not the source of the unit's fighting capability. The unit fights because it is trained to fight. The bond is pleasant but secondary. For humans, the bond is the primary thing. It is not a side effect of being together. It is the reason they function the way they do. When a human soldier tells me they went back for their unit, they are not expressing sentiment. They are describing their actual motivation with complete accuracy. The unit is not enhanced by the bond. For humans, the bond is the engine that runs everything else. I have studied this carefully over many years. I have read their history, their literature, their after-action reports, their personal letters. Humans have been fighting in organized groups for as long as they have recorded their own history. And the pattern is always the same. The groups that fight hardest, that hold the longest, that do the things that should not be possible, are always the groups whose members feel the deepest connection to each other. Not the best equipped groups, not the most physically capable groups, the most connected ones. Now consider what this means in practical terms. A species that fights for strategic objectives will recalculate when the strategic objective becomes too costly. That is rational. That is what you should do. A species that fights for the people beside them does not recalculate in the same way, because the calculation is not, is this objective worth the cost? The calculation is that person worth it? And the answer a human soldier gives to that question, over and over and over again, in field hospitals and ruined corridors and positions that should have been abandoned hours ago, is yes. Yes, without hesitation. Yes, without asking what the strategic outcome will be. Yes, because the alternative is not accepting a poor trade. The alternative is leaving someone behind, and that is something most humans simply cannot make themselves do. I have seen this tested. I have seen human soldiers given clear, direct orders to withdraw and leave wounded companions, and I have watched them look at those orders for a moment, and then look at the person on the ground, and then do something that is technically a violation of their chain of command, but is so deeply woven into who they are, that no training has ever successfully removed it. They stay, or they go back. Every time. On my last night in the field hospital, I had a long conversation with a young man named Private Dio Whitfield. He was 22 years old, from a place called Lagos, and he had a way of talking about serious things in a light tone that I later learned is a distinctly human way of handling difficult subjects. He had come in with injuries that were real but manageable, and he was clearly feeling better because he was asking the medical staff questions about how the equipment worked and making observations about the design of the tent with genuine curiosity. I asked Deo how long humans had been going to war. He thought about it and said, forever, basically, as long as we have been people. I asked if that meant humans were naturally aggressive. He shook his head. He said, not exactly. I think we are naturally protective. Aggressive is what happens when protection goes wrong. I asked him to explain the difference. He said, aggressive means you go out looking for a fight. Protective means you go looking for a reason to fight. We almost always find one. That is probably not great. But it means we are never fighting for nothing. There is always something we are fighting for. I thought about Owen Price in the Eastern Corridor. I thought about Lucy Hale going back with her arm in a brace. I thought about Arthur Dale, 6 hours with an untreated shoulder, updating tactical notes with one hand. They were all fighting for something, specific things, real things, things they could see and name. Dio Whitfield went back to his unit the following morning, ahead of the medical clearance schedule. He gave me a small wave as he left the tent. I watched him walk out into the gray morning light, steady on his feet, moving like someone who had somewhere to be. I had been trying to figure out what made humans different in combat since the moment I watched them hold Kethmora's Eastern Corridor. Sitting in that hospital tent on the third morning, I thought I was beginning to see it. It was not what they were willing to do to an enemy. It was what they were unwilling to accept for the people beside them. There was a line in their minds, drawn around the people they cared about, and on their side of that line, the word impossible simply did not mean the same thing it meant everywhere else. I was not yet finished being surprised. Not even close, but I was starting to understand the shape of the thing I was dealing with. And it was much bigger than any report I had ever written. The week after I left the field hospital, Command assigned me to embed directly with a human unit for observation purposes. I was told this was a standard intelligence gathering rotation. What it actually was, I believe, was someone in our command structure who had read my preliminary field notes and wanted to know if I was seeing what they thought I was seeing. The unit was Alpha Section, 3rd Human Expeditionary, 11 soldiers. Their commanding officer was a woman named Captain Laura Osei, who was 34 years old, spoke with complete precision, and had a habit of listening to people all the way to the end of their sentences before she began forming her response. I noticed this in our first conversation and found it unusual. Most species, in my experience, begin their response approximately halfway through the other person's statement. Laura Osei waited. Every time. I later understood that this was not politeness. It was a tactical habit. She was collecting all available information before drawing conclusions. She did this in conversation the same way she did it in the field. The unit's home at the time was a forward camp approximately 4 kilometers from the active contact zone. It was a temporary structure, prefabricated panels and reinforced canvas, the kind of installation that is meant to be efficient rather than comfortable. I had been in dozens of similar camps with Vorkai, Dravathi, and Sulin units. They all look roughly the same from the outside. The inside of this one was completely different. The first thing I noticed was the photographs. They were everywhere. Fixed to the panels with small adhesive squares, slipped into the edges of equipment racks, tucked into the frames of personal lockers. Photographs of people, mostly. Families, I learned later. Parents, partners, siblings, friends, children. One soldier, a quiet man named Private Sam Cooper, had 17 photographs organized in a careful grid above his sleeping area. When I asked him about them, he named every person in every photograph without looking at his notes. There were also plants. 3 different soldiers had managed to cultivate small plants in narrow containers, growing under artificial light. I asked about this too. The answer, from a young woman named Private Grace Adler, was straightforward. It makes the place feel real. I did not understand that answer for several days. Then I did. Vorkai soldiers, in a temporary forward camp, maintain their efficiency by maintaining psychological distance from the temporary nature of their surroundings. The camp is a functional space. You do not invest in it because investment would be wasted when you move. This is rational. This is how you conserve emotional energy for the things that require it. Grace Adler's plants were the opposite strategy entirely. She was investing in a temporary space on purpose. She was making it real, as she said, which meant making it feel like a place she belonged, a place she had some connection to, a place that mattered. Why would you do that in a war zone? Because, I eventually concluded, it is very difficult for a human to fight hard for something they have no connection to. They need to feel at home somewhere, even in the middle of nowhere, so that when they go out into the contact zone, they are going out to protect something real, something that belongs to them, even if that something is 3 small plants under a light panel. The photographs served the same purpose. They were not decoration, they were reminders. Every time a soldier looked up at those photographs, they were seeing the specific reason they were here, in portable, visible form. It took me almost 2 full days to stop seeing these things as quirks and start seeing them as a system. And once I saw it as a system, I could not stop seeing how completely it was designed. Not deliberately. I do not think humans designed it consciously, but how it had evolved over generations of people fighting in terrible conditions, into something that works. Everything in that camp, the photographs and the plants and the food they cooked on equipment not technically designed for cooking, and the handwritten notes they left each other on the communication board, was part of a way of living that kept them human, in a situation designed to strip that away. Most military cultures try to reduce the individual. You are a unit, not a person. You follow orders, not instincts. You suppress the self because the self is vulnerable. Human military culture does the same thing in training and doctrine, but in practice, in the actual living of it, human soldiers preserve the individual obsessively. They know each other's names, their families, their histories. Their opinions on things that have nothing to do with the mission. They argue, joke, remember birthdays, share food, ask about each other's loved ones by name. And this, I came to understand, is not a weakness in their military culture, it is the engine of it. A soldier who knows you, really knows you, the way these 11 people knew each other, will not leave you. Not because of orders, not because of doctrine, because leaving you would mean leaving a part of themselves, and humans are very bad at doing that. I watched this play out in real time on the 4th day of my embed. The unit received orders for a reconnaissance mission into a sector that had been marked as unpredictable after a recent shift in collective movement patterns. It was a mid-risk mission, not the worst kind, but not routine. Captain Osei briefed the section clearly and precisely. Questions were asked, questions were answered. The plan was solid. Then, about 20 minutes before departure, I noticed something. The soldiers were going around to each other, not in any organized way, just naturally, in pairs and small groups, and talking. Not about the mission, about other things. Private Sam Cooper was telling Private Grace Adler about a restaurant he wanted to visit when he got home. Arthur Dale, now fully recovered from his shoulder, was listening to a long story from a young soldier named Private Ned Brooks about something that had happened to Ned's father, a story that had apparently been interrupted twice before, and was finally being finished. I asked Captain Osei what was happening. She watched her soldiers for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "They are reminding each other who they are. You go into something uncertain. You want to know the people beside you, not their tactical profiles, them." I asked if this was standard practice. She smiled, just slightly. She said, "It is not in any manual." The reconnaissance mission went smoothly. The unit moved efficiently, communicated clearly, and returned with the intelligence they had been sent to gather. But I noticed, throughout the mission, how constantly they were in low-level contact with each other. Not loud communication that would compromise their position, but steady, quiet checking. A look, a gesture. The kind of attention you pay to someone when you are genuinely concerned with their well-being and not just their operational status. On the way back to camp, walking through the gray morning with the dust of the outer sector still on our boots, I found myself beside Private Ned Brooks. He was 19 years old, the youngest member of the section, and he had a curious habit of noticing small things, a shape in the terrain, an unusual sound, the way the light changed at certain times of day, and commenting on them quietly to whoever was nearby. He pointed out a cluster of small rocks arranged in a very specific pattern near the edge of the path. He said he thought an animal had done it, building something without knowing why. I said I did not know the animal life of this region well enough to comment. He said, "It is strange that they build things just because something in them says to build. No plan, no reason, just building." I looked at him. He was still looking at the rocks. I thought about the photographs above Sam Cooper's bunk. I thought about Grace Adler's plants. I thought about the handwritten notes on the communication board. I thought about the half-finished story about Ned's Father's Day that had finally been completed 20 minutes before a mission because someone needed to hear the end of it. Humans build things just because something in them says to build, even in places where there is no reason to build, even when the building is temporary, even when everything around them is designed to remind them that nothing here is meant to last. They build anyway. They connect anyway. They remember each other's names and stories, and the names of people they have never met, because those people matter to someone they care about, and that is enough. It was near the end of my embed period that the unit received the news that changed the tone of everything. A casualty report came in from an adjacent section. A soldier named Private Patrick Cole, 21 years old, had been lost in an engagement 2 days prior. He was from Arthur Dale's original unit and had transferred to the adjacent section 3 weeks before. He had been at the camp for a meal one evening, and several members of Alpha Section had met him. The news came in the evening. I watched the section receive it. There was a specific kind of silence that followed, the kind that has weight and texture. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that had no sound. Then the questions started. Not loudly, quietly, person to person. How? Was it quick? Was he alone? The questions that humans ask when they are trying to understand something that resists understanding. Captain Osei sat with her section for an hour. She did not give a speech. She did not redirect to mission focus or next objectives. She sat with them, and they talked about Patrick Cole, the things they remembered about him, a joke he had made at dinner, something he had said about his plans after the service ended. I watched this and tried to understand it within the framework I had been building. Grief, in most species I have studied, is managed in private or in species-specific ritual. You separate the grief from the function. You process it on one side and return to your operational capacity on the other. The two streams do not mix, because mixing them would compromise both. These humans were mixing them completely and deliberately. They were sitting in a circle and talking about someone they had lost, and they were letting themselves feel that loss fully, together, in the middle of a forward camp 4 kilometers from an active contact zone. And when they stood up an hour later, something had happened that I did not expect. They were not subdued. They were not compromised. They were absolutely focused in a way they had not been before. Precise, and quiet, and completely present. Captain Osei caught me watching and came to stand beside me. She said, "We do not hide it. We carry it." I asked if it made them less effective. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "It makes us remember what we are doing here." I thought about that as I watched her rejoin her section. I thought about every efficiency model I had ever been taught, every strategic framework that treated emotional experience as a variable to be controlled and minimized. Humans do not minimize it. They put it right in the center of everything. They sit with it in a circle. They say the name of the person they lost out loud. They let it hurt, and then they stand up carrying the weight of it, and they continue. I do not know if this is the right way to handle loss. I am not a philosopher or a physician. I am a military observer. What I can tell you, from 41 cycles of field experience, is that the section that stood up after that hour around Patrick Cole's memory was one of the most capable fighting units I have observed in my entire career. They were not fighting with grief. They were fighting with purpose that the grief had sharpened into something harder and clearer than before. The last thing I want to tell you about those weeks embedded with Alpha Section is something small. It is not a tactical observation or a psychological analysis. It is just something that happened. On one of the final evenings, Captain Laura Osei brought out a small device and played music. Not military music, just music. The kind that people play when they want to feel something, without having to explain what the something is. Some of the soldiers talked quietly. Some just listened. The camp was still within range of the contact zone. The situation had not changed. For about 40 minutes, none of them thought about that. Then Osei turned the music off, and they became soldiers again without any visible transition, as if there was a switch they all found simultaneously without anyone giving the signal. I asked Dio Whitfield about it later. He was in the camp for a brief resupply visit, and I had mentioned what I had seen. He said, "You have to remember how to be a person, otherwise you lose the reason you are doing any of this." I wrote that down. I still have it in my original field notes, in the precise notation I used in those years. You have to remember how to be a person. I think that is the most important strategic doctrine the humans never officially wrote down. 3 weeks after my embed with Alpha Section ended, I was part of a small reconnaissance group that was separated from the main force during a collective flanking movement. The separation was not planned. These things rarely are. There were 6 of us. Captain Laura Osei had recommended me for the secondary reconnaissance team, and I had accepted because I had learned, in the weeks of my embed, that recommendations from Laura Osei were worth following. The team included 3 humans, 1 Vorkai myself, 1 Dravathi named Veth, and 1 Sulan named Iru. We were cut off in a collapsed infrastructure zone, an area that had once been a transit facility, and was now a maze of broken walls, dead power systems, and unstable overhead sections. The collective had swept through it 2 days prior, and while they had moved on from the main structure, there were still active units in the surrounding grid. We had to stay hidden, stay quiet, and stay alive for approximately 3 days, until a window opened for extraction. In that compressed, difficult space, I learned more about humans than I had in the previous month of formal observation. Because in the field hospital and the forward camp, I was an outside observer watching a system function. In that collapsed infrastructure zone, I was inside the system, dependent on it, and the people around me were no longer subjects of study. They were the reason I was going to survive, or not survive, the next 72 hours. The 3 humans were Owen Price, who I had first seen at Kethmora, Private Dio Whitfield, and a woman named Corporal Alice Marsh, who was 30 years old and had the most efficient movement I had ever observed in any person of any species. She moved like she had calculated the path before she took it, No wasted motion. No adjustment mid-step. She had been a competitive runner before her service, she told me later, as if that explained it. It only partly explained it. The first challenge arrived within 4 hours. Iru, our Sulan team member, had a physiological reaction to the particulate matter in the collapsed zone. Sulan respiratory systems are sensitive in ways that other species often underestimate. She was not in danger, but she was in distress. A particular kind of Sulan distress that involves involuntary auditory responses that carry quite far in enclosed spaces. We needed her silent. She could not be silent. She was trying, genuinely trying, and she could not manage it. Owen Price moved to her without anyone asking him to. He did not say anything immediately. He positioned himself next to her, very close, and put one hand on her back in a slow, steady rhythm, not a restraining hold, a grounding one. Just pressure, regular and calm, with a pace that was slower than her own distress. Sulan physiology responds to rhythmic external stimulus as a regulating signal. I knew this from my training. Owen Price, as far as I could determine, did not know this from any formal study. He seemed to know it the way some people know things, from paying attention to what works. Iru quieted within 10 minutes. She was not cured of her reaction, but she was managing it. Owen stayed close to her for the next 2 hours, maintaining that slow, steady rhythm whenever the distress started to rise, and gradually the intervals between incidents grew longer. I asked him afterward how he had known what to do. He said, "I did not know. I guess that she needed to feel like something was stable. That is usually what people need when everything is moving too fast." He had transferred a principle from human psychology to an alien physiology, through pure observation and reasoning, and it had worked. I made a note. My notes from those 3 days are the longest continuous observation record I have ever compiled. On the first night, we divided the watch schedule. This is standard procedure in any survival situation. What was not standard, or at least not standard in any military framework I had been trained in, was how the humans managed the schedule in practice. Vorkai watch rotation is strict and equal. Everyone bears the same burden. Deviation from the schedule is a sign of weakness or poor discipline. The humans looked at the 6 of us, assessed something I did not fully see them assessing, and then quietly arranged the schedule so that Veth, who had a genuine fear of darkness, that they had apparently noticed without Veth mentioning it, was never alone on watch, so that Iru was on the lowest stress rotation while she was still managing her respiratory response, so that the humans themselves took the hardest windows without making any announcement about it. I asked Dio about this in a whispered conversation at the second watch change. He said, "You figure out what each person can handle, and then you build the plan around people, not the other way around." I said, "Most tactical frameworks build plans first, and assign people to fit them." He considered this. Then he said, "That is probably why some tactical frameworks lose a lot of people." On the second night, I was on watch with Owen Price, at approximately 3 in the morning by the human time system. The infrastructure zone was quiet, which is a different thing from safe, but quiet enough that there was a long stretch where the only sound was the distant settling of unstable structure and the faint movement of air through the broken ceiling sections. Owen was very still. He has a quality of stillness when he is not moving that is unusual even among trained soldiers, a kind of settled presence, like a piece of furniture that has decided where it belongs and is not concerned about being moved. After a long silence, he said, "You have been studying us." I said I had. I said that was the reason I had been assigned to the embed. He said, "What have you worked out?" I told him honestly that I was still working. I told him that the framework I had arrived with at Kethmora had turned out to be wrong, and that I was building a new one, but it was not finished. He thought about this, then he asked, "What was wrong about the first framework?" I told him, "I was measuring the wrong things." He accepted that. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "What are you measuring now?" I thought about that question for a long moment. Then I said, "I am trying to understand why the word impossible does not work the same way in your language as it does in mine." Owen Price looked out into the dark of the infrastructure zone for a while. A sound moved through the broken structure, settling dust and small debris, and we were both completely still until it passed. Then he said, "Impossible means a thing cannot happen. We do not really believe that. We think most things are just very difficult, and the word impossible is what you say when you have not found the right way yet." I wrote that down later, from memory, as precisely as I could. The extraction window came on the morning of the 3rd day. earlier than expected because a secondary team had managed to clear a path through the eastern edge of the grid. We moved through the zone in a tight group, Alice Marsh on point because her movement was simply better than anyone else's, Owen and Dio covering the flanks, Veth and Iru in the protected center, and myself somewhere in the middle, doing my best to keep pace and stay quiet. We reached the extraction point without engagement. The transport was already waiting. As we moved toward it, I realized that somewhere in the previous 72 hours, I had stopped thinking of myself as an observer and started thinking of myself as the seventh member of this group. Not consciously, not by decision. It had simply happened, as gradually and completely as the light changing from night to morning. On the transport, as we were ascending away from the contact zone, I looked at the 5 people who had kept me alive and thought about everything I had been trying to understand for the past month. I had been trying to find the secret, the specific thing, the identifiable mechanism that made humans effective in combat in ways that defied their biological profile. I had been looking for it, the way you look for a component in a machine, something that could be isolated and studied and understood independently. But watching Alice Marsh navigate a path through rubble in perfect silence, watching Owen Price sit still beside a frightened alien in the dark and find the exact right thing to do without being told, watching Deo Whitfield update tactical information with his body still registering exhaustion from 2 sleepless nights, I understood that there was no isolated component. It was not any one thing, it was the combination, the connection to each other, and the refusal to let that connection break. The investment in the people beside them, so deep and so real, that withdrawing from a position meant abandoning something they could not abandon. The ability to sit with loss and grief and let it become purpose rather than paralysis. The way they could be people, fully and completely, and then be soldiers, fully and completely, without one compromising the other. And underneath all of it, quieter than the rest but more fundamental, the belief, apparently unshakable, that the story was not finished, that things were difficult, not impossible, that there was always a way through, even when the way through was not visible yet. That is what I had been trying to name since Kethmora, that specific thing, that quality without a clean word in Vorkai language. The closest I have ever managed is this. Humans believe, in some place below reasoning and above instinct, that the situation is always improvable, not always winnable, not always painless, but always able to be acted upon. There is always something you can do. There is always a next move. It is a belief so fundamental to them that they do not think of it as a belief. They think of it as just the way things are. As the transport rose above the contact zone and the gray landscape fell away below us, I looked at Owen Price. He was asleep. He had fallen asleep within 3 minutes of boarding, as if some internal switch had simply registered that the immediate requirement was over, and it was now acceptable to rest. He looked, in that moment, completely ordinary, a young man sleeping on a military transport, with dust on his uniform and lines of tiredness around his eyes. I thought about the eastern corridor at Kethmora, 9 hours, 3 times the force they should have needed, the math that said they could not hold it. I thought about what Owen had told me on watch. Impossible means a thing cannot happen. We do not really believe that. I did not have the full picture yet. I did not know that yet. But I was beginning to see the outline of it, and it was larger than I had imagined, and older than any war we were currently fighting, and it was woven into these people so deeply that you could not remove it without removing them entirely. I slept for most of the flight back. When I woke, Owen Price was already awake, and looking at a map on his handheld device, planning something. He never stopped planning something. I have given this lecture 212 times in 30 years. The cadets sitting before me now are the youngest group I have addressed, and also, in some ways, the most important. Many of them will serve alongside human units in their first postings. Some of them will spend years embedded with human forces, as I did. All of them need to understand what they are going to encounter. So let me be direct with you. You are going to see things that do not fit your existing models of combat behavior. You are going to watch a human soldier return to a position you have assessed as untenable, and hold it. You are going to watch a human commander make a decision that looks irrational, and turn out to be the decision that saves the mission. You are going to watch human soldiers grieve in the middle of operations, laugh in the middle of danger, sleep in the middle of chaos, and then stand up and function with a clarity and precision that you would not have predicted was available to them. None of this is accidental. None of it is luck. It is the product of a way of being that humans have developed over a very long time, in very hard conditions, and it is not easy to understand from the outside, but it is possible to understand if you pay attention. Here is what I have learned. I am going to say it plainly. Humans are not exceptional because of what they will do to an enemy. They are exceptional because of what they will not do to each other. That refusal, that absolute unwillingness to leave their people behind, or to stop when the people beside them still need them, is the core of everything. It is not sentiment. It is structure. It is the framework their entire combat capability is built on, and once you understand it, everything else becomes clear. They are also exceptional because of how they process adversity. Every species has a breaking point, a threshold past which the rational response is to stop. Humans have this threshold too, in theory. In practice, I have spent 30 years looking for the situation that reliably activates it, and I have not found one. What I have found instead is that the conditions which trigger withdrawal or surrender in most species tend to trigger something different in humans. They become focused. They become quiet. They start looking for the next move rather than assessing the overall situation. This is not because they are not afraid. I want to be clear about this, because it is a misunderstanding I encounter constantly in cadets who have not yet served alongside human units. Humans feel fear completely and fully. They are not numb to it. They are not suppressing it through training or biology. They feel it, and they choose, moment by moment, to continue anyway. Private Deo Whitfield told me, on a night watch in a collapsed infrastructure zone with active hostile units moving through the surrounding grid, that he was genuinely frightened. He said it the way you would say anything true, without embarrassment, without apology. He was frightened, and he was on watch, and he would stay on watch for his full shift, and then he would sleep when it was his turn, and then he would be frightened again when the next difficult thing arrived. That is not the absence of fear. That is something much harder, and much more interesting than the absence of fear. That is the choice to continue inside the experience of fear rather than waiting for it to pass. Most species wait for it to pass before they act. Humans act while it is happening. Do you understand how significant that is? Do you understand what it means operationally? When you are in the field and conditions are deteriorating and a decision must be made in the next 30 seconds, that the human soldiers beside you are not waiting to feel ready. They will never feel ready. They know they will never feel ready. They have made a decision somewhere deep in their structure that readiness is not the point. Action is the point. You act, and readiness follows, or it does not, and you act anyway. I want to tell you about something that happened in the last year of the conflict, because it has stayed with me more than almost anything else from that time. We had won the central engagements. The collective was in retreat. The political situation was moving toward a resolution that everyone knew was coming, and the question had shifted from whether we would win to exactly what the winning would look like. There was one remaining contested installation, a communications relay that had strategic value in the early stages of a conflict but had become, by that point, primarily a symbol. The kind of thing that gets fought over at the end of wars because neither side wants to be the one that ceded it, even when the practical importance has passed. The human forces were assigned to take the relay. They did. The engagement lasted 11 hours, and it was as hard and unpleasant as any engagement I witnessed in the entire conflict, because by that stage both sides were tired, and tired soldiers make careful, grinding combat that takes a long time. Afterward, when the relay was secured, I stood in the main operational space of the installation and watched the human unit do the same thing they did after every completed engagement. They checked on each other. Not the official casualty check that had already been done. This was the other check, the one where you look at the people beside you and make sure you know they are real and present and still here. I watched Arthur Dale, who by that point had been my unofficial field companion for the better part of a year, go through every member of his section with a quiet word, a hand on a shoulder, a look that communicated something I still cannot fully translate, something between acknowledgement and gratitude, and something else, something that does not have a word in my language, because we do not experience it in exactly that form. When he got to me, he did the same thing. He put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me for a moment and said, "Good." That was all. Good. One word. I have received formal commendations. I have received statements of gratitude from senior officers of multiple species. I have been given awards and acknowledgments and carefully worded letters of appreciation for my service. None of them landed the way that one word did, because it was not an evaluation. It was a recognition. You are here. I see you. Good. That is what humans do for each other, constantly. In the middle of everything, they recognize each other. They confirm that the person beside them is real and present, and that their presence matters. They do this with words and gestures, and the specific kind of attention that communicates, "I know you are here, and the fact that you are here is important to me." I have tried to explain this to colleagues who have not served alongside humans. It sounds simple when I describe it. It is not simple. It is one of the most technically demanding things I have ever witnessed, because it requires a soldier to remain emotionally present and available to the people beside them, under conditions that are specifically designed to eliminate emotional availability. The field strips you down. It takes away comfort and safety and certainty and rest, and what it leaves, in most species, is a functional operational unit, technically capable, but fundamentally alone inside the experience. Humans do not let that happen to each other. They will not allow the people beside them to be alone inside the experience. It is, as far as I can tell, not even a choice they make consciously. It is simply who they are. I want to tell you the last thing I want to tell you, and then I will answer your questions. After the conflict ended, I spent several months in a collaborative assessment process with military analysts from 6 different species, all of whom had served alongside human units during the engagement. We were trying to formalize what we had learned into something that could be incorporated into combined force doctrine for future coalition operations. It was productive work. We made real progress, but there was one thing that none of us could fully resolve, and I want to be honest with you about it, because I think it is important. We could not determine what to do with human soldiers in peacetime. Not because they become dangerous without a conflict. They do not. Humans in peacetime are, by most assessments, remarkable. They build and create and form communities, and pursue knowledge and love each other with the same intensity they bring to everything else. But the soldiers, specifically the soldiers, in the weeks and months immediately following the end of the conflict, showed a pattern that was consistent across all human units we assessed. They were disoriented, not dysfunctional, not broken, but disoriented. The corridor they had built their entire operational identity around, the clear need, the clear purpose, the specific people to protect, had become undefined in the peace. They were still ready to act. There was simply no clear direction for the action to go. Captain Laura Osei told me, in one of our last conversations, that transitioning from combat to peace was the hardest thing she had done in her service. Not because peace was bad, because the skills she had spent years developing were not the skills that peace required, and developing new ones while carrying the old ones intact was more complicated than anything she had faced in the field. I asked her if she missed the conflict. She thought about that for a long time, which was very like her. Then she said, "I miss the clarity. I do not miss the cost of it." I think about that answer regularly. I think it says something true, not just about humans, but about what conflict does to any being that survives it. The final thing I will tell you is this. Attend to the humans beside you, not as assets, not as interesting research subjects, though I understand the temptation. I spent a decade making that exact mistake, as people, because that is what they will be doing for you, whether you invite it or not. They will learn your name and ask about your family, and notice when you are having a difficult day, and find small ways to communicate that they see you, and your presence among them matters. You can maintain professional distance. Many soldiers do. But I will tell you, from the experience of 3 days in a collapsed infrastructure zone with dust on my uniform and very uncertain odds, that when Owen Price sat on the floor of that broken transit facility in the dark and said nothing, just stayed close and awake and steady, I was not thinking about professional distance. I was thinking that whatever happened next, at least this specific person knew I was here. That is what humans give you, if you let them. Not just their tactical capabilities, not just their improbable ability to hold positions that should fall. They give you the experience of being known by someone in the middle of the hardest thing you have ever done. I do not have a word for that in my language either. I have spent 30 years looking for one. A colleague told me recently that I should just borrow the human word. He said they have a lot of good ones. He is not wrong. Dismiss. Go and serve well. And when you find yourself beside a human in a situation that looks finished, look at them before you accept that conclusion. Because they are almost certainly looking at the situation and thinking about the next move. There is always a next move. They taught me that. I have not forgotten it. Neither should you. One more thing. I was asked, before giving this lecture today, If there was a single moment from my time in the field that I would choose to preserve, if I could only keep one, it is not a moment from a battle. It is not the Eastern Corridor at Kethmora, though that changed everything I thought I knew. It is not the 11 hours at the communications relay, though that was as close to the pure form of what I have been describing as anything I have ever witnessed. It is a quiet evening in a forward camp, music playing from a small device, 6 soldiers talking about nothing in particular, 3 small plants under a light panel, 17 photographs on a wall, and a young woman named Grace Adler saying, when I asked why she had planted things in a place she would leave in a week, simply, it makes the place feel real. That is all. That is the whole lecture. That is everything I know. End.